On the day I learned my blood did not match my mother's, the city smelled like wet paper and electric brakes. Glassport was the kind of place that polished its riverfront for tourists and forgot the alleys behind the theaters. So when rain came, it carried two perfumes at once: fresh asphalt by the stations and old grease by the stage doors. I was 17, late for an after-school rehearsal at the Aurelia Playhouse, and holding a permission slip for a school blood drive because our drama teacher believed citizenship was a role you practiced off stage. My mother, Celeste Hart, signed the slip in a looping hand and kissed my forehead with the same careful pressure she used when pinning a wig. She said, "Don't faint." I said, "I never faint." We were both lying, in the harmless way families lie to keep the day moving. The nurse at the blood drive taped a cotton ball to my arm and told me my veins were shy. I laughed and made a joke about stage fright, and she smiled without listening because her job was speed. When she asked for my emergency contact, I gave Celeste's number automatically, like reciting a line I'd memorized years ago. That night, while I painted a backdrop of moonlit waves in the theater's cramped workshop, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. A calm voice introduced herself as Laura Finch from the hospital lab, and she asked if I could come in with a parent. Her tone was polite, not urgent, which made my stomach drop harder. Emergencies shout, but revelations whisper. I called Celeste, and she arrived wearing her rehearsal sweater and a scarf that still smelled faintly of hairspray. My father, Adrian, came too, shoulders tight, as if someone had tightened bolts inside him. The lab office had a framed poster about community health and a plant that looked like it had survived on stubbornness alone. Laura Finch slid a file across the desk and said, "There's been a mismatch in your recorded blood type and the parental sample on file." Celeste blinked once, then said, "That can't be right," as if the universe had made a typo. Adrian asked if someone had switched labels. Laura didn't argue. She opened a second folder with a set of photocopied forms, the kind that carried decades of dust even when printed yesterday. "There had been a coastal storm 17 years ago," she said. "A storm that flooded the old maternity wing and cut the power. During the chaos, 2 infants were temporarily moved to a neighboring ward, and later the record trail fractured." She said it with the practiced neutrality of someone who had delivered this truth before. Celeste reached for my hand like she could anchor me by touch. I stared at the paper until the words blurred and turned into scenery. "We did the DNA test anyway, because disbelief is not a strategy." A week later, Laura called again, and this time she used my full name, Lena Hart, like the name might help hold me together. The results confirmed I was not biologically related to Celeste or Adrian. I was, however, biologically related to a couple named Marin and Ewan Finch, who lived on Kestrel Key, a low island off the eastern coast, famous in travel blogs for bioluminescent tides and in local news for being ignored until disaster. There was also another girl, their daughter by record, Mara Finch, who shared no DNA with them either. So the mistake had not stolen me from a void. It had traded 2 babies like props in a backstage rush. Celeste cried silently in the car afterward, the way she cried when a show closed, because grief and love use the same ducts. Adrian drove with both hands on the wheel, jaw clenched, as if he could steer us out of the fact itself. I expected anger, but what arrived first was embarrassment, a ridiculous sensation, as if I had been caught wearing the wrong costume. At home, I walked through rooms I knew by smell and sound, the kitchen where Celeste's cinnamon tea lived, the hallway where Adrian's tools were hung by size, and everything looked the same, while my brain insisted it had changed. Celeste sat me down at the dining table and said, "I am still your mother." Her voice did not ask permission. It claimed a truth that did not require biology to be real. Adrian added, "I'm still your father," and he looked offended that anyone might doubt it. They told me the same story. How they had struggled to have a child, how they had walked into the hospital during the storm, hoping for safety, how they had carried me home believing the world had finally said yes to them. They did not say, "We deserve you." They said, "We love you." The difference mattered. Still, the word Finch pressed on my thoughts like a new bruise. I asked to meet them, and Celeste surprised me by nodding immediately. She said, "If there's a door you need to open, we open it together." Adrian insisted on coming, and then, after a long pause, he said something stranger. "We should invite the other girl too, the other girl, Mara." He meant the girl raised by my biological parents, the girl I had accidentally replaced. I felt guilt flare, hot and fast, though I had not chosen anything. Celeste, practical as always, called the Finches, and set up a meeting on Kestrel Quay for the following weekend. Glassport had a direct train line to the coast, but the last leg required an old commuter ferry. Adrian called it inconvenient. Celeste called it an adventure. I called it a cliff I would have to step off. We boarded the early train with a paper bag of snacks Celeste had packed in a panic. Sliced pears, a thermos of sweet tea, and a box of crackers shaped like stars. The carriage seats were hard, the kind that make you aware of every bone you own, and the air smelled like cheap coffee and damp coats. Across the aisle sat a girl about my age in a faded windbreaker, hair tied up with a piece of ribbon that looked like it had been repurposed from a gift. She was eating roasted chickpeas from a small tin and reading a dog-eared manual titled Small Engines for Small Boats. When she noticed me watching, she lifted the tin and offered it without a word. Her eyes were bright in a way that suggested she noticed everything and decided which details deserved trouble. I took a few chickpeas. They were salty and oddly comforting. She nodded once, as if we had completed an agreement. Then she said, "You're Lena. I'm Mara." I figured you'd be the one staring at the window like it might explain something. Her voice carried the island's slow vowels, but her sentences were quick. I didn't know what to say, so I said the first honest thing. "I'm sorry." Mara shrugged as if apology was a coat she had seen too many times. "Don't be," she said. "Storms shuffle people. People pretend they didn't." Then she turned the tin around and showed me the label she'd written with marker. "For train." I laughed, startled by the simplicity of it. Mara's smile flickered on, brief as a match. "If you want to feel less sick," she said, "eat something crunchy and look at the horizon. City kids stare at their shoes when they're nervous, but shoes don't move." I wanted to ask what she meant by city kid, what she meant by feeling sick, how she already knew my nervous habits. Instead, I ate another chickpea and watched the landscape flatten into marsh and then open into sea sky. Celeste sat beside Adrian, whispering logistical questions like she could manage emotion by managing schedules. Adrian pretended to read a transit map, but his thumb rubbed the same crease over and over. At the coastal terminal, the air tasted of salt and diesel, and gulls argued above the ticket booth with the confidence of creatures who have never filled out paperwork. Mara led us toward the ferry with the competence of someone who had navigated crowds since childhood. She carried a canvas tote that looked light, but kept producing items when needed. Ginger candies, a compact rain poncho, a roll of mint gum, and a small paper packet labeled "Turtle Tags Do Not Bend." Celeste, fascinated, asked if Mara worked in marine biology. Mara snorted. "I work in whatever needs doing. My parents run the hatchery volunteer crew. I'm the runner." She said hatchery like it was both a job and a family name. Then she glanced at me and added, "Don't worry, nobody on the island is going to grill you like an interview. If they ask questions, it's usually because they want to feed you." The ferry ride was short but loud, the engine thrumming through the deck until my teeth felt like they were buzzing. On the open side, the wind slapped my cheeks and made my eyes water. Mara leaned on the railing, perfectly balanced, and pointed at a line of low dunes in the distance. "That's Kestrel Quay," she said. "It looks like nothing until you're on it, and then it's everything." As we approached, I saw houses perched on stilts, bright paint peeling in affectionate layers, and a lighthouse that had been repainted so many times it looked thick as armor. Children ran along the dock, chasing each other with plastic buckets. A man in rubber boots lifted a crate of seaweed with ease. Somewhere a radio played a song that sounded older than the buildings. Mara waved at half the dock without stopping, and half the dock waved back. I felt suddenly transparent, like I was walking into someone else's life. Marin and Ewan Finch were waiting at the end of the pier. Marin was small and sun-browned, her hair tied back with a scarf patterned with tiny fish. Ewan was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore the tired smile of someone who wakes before dawn on purpose. They stood with their hands clasped as if afraid any sudden movement might break the moment. Mara slowed down, then tugged my sleeve gently, a wordless warning that this was heavy even for her. Marin's eyes fixed on me, and I saw my own face in hers, not identical, but echoed. The same angle at the eyebrow, the same stubborn chin. She stepped forward, stopped, then stepped forward again, as if she needed a second attempt at courage. "Lena," she said, and her voice cracked on the first syllable like a wave hitting rock. I opened my mouth, and nothing came out. Ewan cleared his throat and said, "Welcome home," and the word home hit my ribs like a thrown stone. Celeste reached for Marin's hands first, because Celeste is the kind of person who resolves silence by offering warmth. "Thank you for meeting us," she said, and she meant it. Adrian nodded to Ewan, and their handshake was awkward. two men trying to measure each other without turning it into a contest. Mara broke the tension by clapping once. "All right," she announced. "No standing around like driftwood. We have a turtle release at dusk and food before that." She grabbed my bag, not asking, and started walking as if the island had scheduled our emotions between chores. Marin laughed through tears, relief spilling out of her. "She's bossy," she told Celeste. Celeste replied, "So am I," and they both smiled like allies. The Finch's house sat a few streets inland, where sand turned to packed dirt and fences were made of whatever wood survived last winter. Inside, the kitchen was the center of gravity. A pot of chowder simmered on the stove. A tray of baked rolls sat under a cloth towel, the fabric dotted with steam. There were jars of pickled vegetables lined up like trophies. Okra, beets, sea beans, something purple I couldn't name. Mara pushed a bowl of chowder in front of me and said, "Eat. Islands don't believe in first meetings on an empty stomach." I tasted it and felt my shoulders drop. It was creamy, smoky, and full of tiny clams that snapped with sweetness. Marin watched me eat with an expression that was not hungry but yearning, like she was trying to memorize the way my hands held a spoon. That look made me want to hide and also made me want to stay. Adrian complimented the chowder and then, because he is Adrian, asked what kind of smoke wood Marin used. Ewan launched into an explanation involving alder and wind direction, and Adrian listened like a man receiving vital schematics. After lunch, Mara dragged me outside with a grin that suggested she had been saving a surprise. "Come on," she said. "If you're going to be my accidental sister, you have to learn the island's two sacred skills, knot tying and shell cracking." I protested that I already knew how to tie a bow. Mara laughed. "That's not a knot. That's a decoration." She took me behind the house to a shed where nets hung like sleeping creatures. She handed me a length of rope and demonstrated a bowline with quick fingers, then made me repeat it until my hands stopped shaking. Every time I made the loop wrong, she corrected me without teasing. Her patience surprised me more than her competence. When I finally tied it correctly, she bumped her shoulder against mine, a small gesture of approval that felt like acceptance. Then she produced a bag of sunflower seeds and said, "Now for shell cracking." I admitted I didn't eat seeds much. Mara's eyes widened. "How have you survived?" she asked, as if seeds were an entire food group. She showed me how to split a seed between my teeth without biting my tongue, and when I succeeded, she whooped loud enough to make a neighbor's dog bark. Later, while we walked toward the beach hatchery, I noticed Mara flicking empty shells into the grass without looking. I hesitated, then said, "Is that okay? Littering feels wrong." Mara stopped, turned, and put on a perfect imitation of my careful city intonation. "Is that okay?" she echoed, eyes wide with mock innocence. My cheeks burned. Then she softened, holding up a fistful of shells. "They rot down," she said. "They feed the soil. Nothing here goes to waste if we can help it." She dropped the shells and kept walking. I realized she wasn't mocking me to be cruel. She was mocking the part of me that apologized for existing. On stage, I could be loud and fearless. In life, I had learned to be polite as armor. Mara was gently trying to pry that armor off. The hatchery sat behind a line of dune grass, a low building with weathered boards, and a hand-painted sign that read, "Kestrel Turtle Watch, ask first, walk softly." Volunteers moved around with headlamps and clipboards. The sand was raked in careful patterns, and small stakes marked nests like tiny grave markers for a hopeful future. Mara introduced me to everyone as if I belonged, and nobody questioned it. They simply nodded and handed me tasks. "Hold this flashlight," said an older woman with a voice like sandpaper. "Count the hatchlings that make it to the waterline," said a man with sun-bleached hair. "Don't step on the tracks," said a teen who looked younger than me but carried authority like a badge. Celeste watched, visibly relieved that the island offered structure. Adrian asked about the wiring of the incubation room, and ended up helping fix a loose outlet because he cannot enter a building without repairing something. Marin hovered near me at first, then forced herself to step back, letting me move without being held, which was its own kind of courage. As dusk thickened, the sky turned bruised purple. The tide rolled in, and the wet sand reflected the last light like a mirror trying to keep it. Mara handed me a clipboard. "You'll be fine," she said. "If you miss a count, the universe won't collapse." "That's easy for you to say," I muttered. "You act like you were born sure of yourself." Mara laughed quietly. "I was born screaming," she said. "That's different. Then the first hatchling appeared, a tiny dark head pushing through sand with the determination of something that had waited long enough. More followed, dozens, then hundreds, a moving scatter of life. The volunteers stayed quiet, but I felt everyone's breath sink in awe. I crouched low, watching the hatchlings scramble toward the sound of waves, their flippers carving frantic commas into the sand. One turned the wrong way, toward the dunes. Without thinking, I blocked it gently with my hand, guiding it toward the water. It bumped my fingers, stubborn, then corrected course. Mara watched me do it, and her expression shifted into something tender and startled, like she had not expected me to belong to this kind of work. After the release, we sat on the porch steps of the hatchery, sharing a thermos of hot chocolate from someone's backpack. The volunteers talked about weather patterns, predator tracks, grant applications, and the never-ending battle against plastic waste. I listened and realized the island's survival was a series of small fights, fought daily without applause. Mara nudged my knee and whispered, "Want to see the glow?" She led me down to the shoreline where the water, disturbed by our footsteps, ignited in faint blue sparks. "Bioluminescent plankton," she said. "The island's secret fireworks." I dragged my hand through the shallow water and watched the light trail my fingers. For the first time since the lab call, something inside me loosened. Celeste stood farther back, her scarf fluttering, watching me as if she were learning a new version of her own daughter. Adrian looked at the glowing water and said, "It's like circuitry," and I thought, of course he would see it that way. Marin leaned close to Celeste and said something I couldn't hear, but Celeste's shoulders fell, and she nodded, and whatever passed between them seemed like a truce the universe hadn't bothered to draft. That night we slept in a small guest room at the Finch's house. The sheets smelled of sun and laundry soap. I lay awake listening to wind tap the windows like a question. My phone had no service, and the absence of notifications felt like a strange peace. Mara lay on the other side of the thin wall. I could hear her moving, restless. I wanted to speak, to name the awkwardness between us, but naming things has always felt like tempting fate. Instead, I stared at the ceiling and tried to imagine being raised here. Learning tides instead of traffic, knots instead of stage cues. In the dark, my guilt returned, sharp. I had eaten chowder that should have been hers, slept in a city bedroom that should have been mine, wore clothes my biological mother never chose. But then I remembered Mara's competence, her laughter, her pride in the island. She wasn't a victim waiting for restitution. She was a person who had built herself in the space she had. The thought didn't erase guilt, but it made it less poisonous. Morning arrived with a chorus of gulls and the smell of fried dough. Marin had made something called tide cakes, golden and airy, dusted with sugar. Celeste, delighted, asked for the recipe. Marin wrote it down on the back of a volunteer flyer, hand shaking slightly as she formed each letter. Adrian inspected the porch railing and fixed a loose nail, earning Ewan's approving grunt. Mara announced that we were going to the lighthouse. Not the tourist path, she clarified. The maintenance path. She handed me boots 2 sizes too big and told me to stop worrying about looking graceful. At the lighthouse, the paint smelled fresh, and the stairs spiraled upward like a promise. Mara pointed at a patch of wall covered in pencil marks and small dates. "Storm levels," she said. "Every year we record how high the water gets." My stomach tightened. "You expect more storms?" I asked. Ewan answered from behind us, voice steady. "We expect the ocean to do what oceans do. We plan." His calm was not denial. It was preparation. It reminded me of Adrian's diagrams and Celeste's rehearsals. Different worlds, same discipline. Over lunch at a picnic table near the harbor, Mara said casually, "The island might not be here in 20 years if the council keeps selling pieces of it." Celeste asked what she meant. Marin hesitated, then told us about the developer. A company from the mainland had offered to buy the southern dunes to build a private resort. They promised jobs, they promised flood barriers, they promised a future that looked good in brochures. But the dunes were where turtles nested and where the island absorbed storms. Cut them, and you cut the island's lungs. Mara crushed a tide cake between her fingers like she was imagining the dunes. "They've been pressuring the council," she said. "They say the hatchery is sentimental nonsense." I felt anger spark in me, surprising in its immediacy. In Glassport, I was used to watching wealthy people buy decisions like tickets. Here, the consequences would be sand and water and bodies. Adrian asked, "Who owns the dunes?" Marin said, "Technically the community, but paperwork is messy." Celeste's eyes narrowed in the way they did when a producer tried to cut a scene. Messy paperwork is where villains hide, she said. Back in Glassport, the theater was already struggling. A fire years ago had damaged the backstage wall, and insurance had paid just enough to keep the building alive but not enough to make it safe. Adrian spent nights patching wiring. Celeste fought donors who wanted creative control. Now, on Kestrel Key, I watched my parents instinctively join another fight, not because it was theirs, but because they didn't know how to watch harm happen quietly. Celeste asked for meeting dates, council names, public hearing rules. Adrian requested copies of the flood reports. Mara looked at them with wary amusement. "You two are like visiting storms yourselves," she said. Celeste replied, "Good. The island could use weather on its side." I found myself smiling. For the first time since the truth, the grown-ups weren't arranging themselves into enemies. They were aligning. That afternoon, Mara dragged me into the old community hall, a building that smelled of salt and old varnish. Posters from decades of festivals covered the walls. Lantern Tide, Crab Derby, Winter Soup Night, each one hand-painted and proudly crooked. Mara pointed at a blank section of wall. "We need a new festival," she said. "Something that makes people come and makes the council remember who they're supposed to serve." I raised an eyebrow. "You want to fight a developer with a festival?" Mara grinned. "Developers hate crowds that don't belong to them." She handed me a stack of old paint buckets and said, "You're the theater kid. Make something that looks like hope." I stared at the buckets, then at the wall, and felt the old familiar click of purpose. I sketched a concept on scrap paper. Waves that turned into hands, hands that turned into turtle tracks, tracks that turned into lantern light. Mara leaned over my shoulder, chewing a mint candy. "That's good," she said, then added, "Make it bigger. Island hope is loud." Over the next weeks, my life split into two settings like a play with alternating scenes. On weekdays, I was in Glassport, finishing school, rehearsing for our spring performance, and pretending my world hadn't shifted. On weekends, I took the train and ferry to Kestrel Key, where I painted murals, helped sort hatchery supplies, and learned the names of winds. Mara and I texted when service allowed. Her messages were short, often just photos. A turtle track, a broken sign, a council flyer, a pot of chowder. Sometimes she sent voice notes that started with, "Don't laugh," and ended with her laughing first. Celeste and Marin became odd pen pals, swapping recipes and complaint lists. Adrian and Ewan exchanged schematics about flood-resistant wiring like they had known each other in a previous life. The island fight gathered momentum, and I realized something unsettling. The crisis had given us a shared project, and shared projects are easier than shared grief. At school, rumors still found me, because high school feeds on novelty. Someone saw me on a ferry selfie with Mara and decided it meant scandal. A girl named Petra, who had always treated generosity like a ladder, said loudly in the hallway that I was a charity case who had stolen a rich family. The words hit harder than I expected, not because they were true, but because they were familiar. People love simple stories, where someone must be guilty. I stood there holding my script for rehearsal, throat tight. Then Kira Danton, my longtime rival in drama club, stepped between Petra and me. Kira had mocked my quietness for years, calling me porcelain. Now she said, "Petra, your hobby is being cruel, and it's boring." She looked at me and added, "Lena earned her scholarship and carried half this club on her back during Tech Week, so pick a different target." Petra sputtered. Kira shrugged. "I can insult Lena myself if I want," she said, "but I'm not letting you do it." The class laughed, and Petra retreated. I blinked at Kira, stunned. Kira rolled her eyes and whispered, "Don't, Mila. Don't make it weird." Then she walked away. Later, Mara texted me a photo of a turtle hatchling with the caption, "Strays bite." I laughed out loud in the cafeteria, surprising everyone, including myself. The council hearing was scheduled for late May, and the developers' representatives arrived with polished slides and catered sandwiches, as if feeding people could soften the theft. The community hall filled beyond capacity. Some people wore hatchery shirts, some wore work boots, still dusty from the docks. A few tourists showed up because the Lantern Tide posters were everywhere now. My mural splashed across social media with the tag number "Walk Softly." I sat beside Mara in the front row. She had braided her hair with a thin strip of reflective tape so it caught light when she moved. "Nervous?" I asked, tentative. She shook her head. "Angry," she corrected. "Anger is steadier." Celeste stood at the back with Marin, arms crossed, watching the developer's speaker with the expression she reserved for bad acting. Adrian sat with Ewan, both men holding folders thicker than the developer's glossy packet. "Evidence," Adrian murmured to me when I glanced back. "It's always evidence." When the council chair called for public comment, the room tightened. The developer's representative spoke first, describing economic revitalization and safety infrastructure. He said the dunes were underutilized and that modern engineering could replace natural inefficiency. I felt Mara's knee bounce beside mine. Then Marin stood up. Her hands shook, but her voice didn't. She talked about nesting seasons, about storms, about how dunes were not decoration but defense. She spoke of the hatchery volunteers who walked the beach at midnight to protect life no one paid them to protect. She did not use big words. She used names, dates, and numbers. After her, Adrian stood and presented the flood data, showing how the dunes absorbed surge. Ewan explained, in plain terms, how building on the dunes would redirect water toward homes. Then Celeste spoke, and the room leaned forward because her voice carried performance without being fake. She said, "When you sell safety for profit, you don't build a future. You borrow one and charge interest to the people who can least afford it." Applause broke out, messy and loud. The council chair called for order, but her mouth twitched as if she wanted to smile. Mara stood last. She didn't bring notes. She held up a small jar of sand and a small jar of water, both collected from the dune line. "This sand," she said, "is why your houses didn't wash away in the last storm. This water is what will come for you if you sell it." She looked at the council members one by one. "Some of you were here when I was 5, she said. "You watched me trip over the same board on this hall's porch because nobody fixed it. Don't tell me you'll build barriers now. Fix what you already have." Her voice cracked, then steadied. "If you want to help the island," she said, "fund the hatchery, fix the dock, and stop treating us like a pretty background for someone else's vacation." The room went quiet, not because people disagreed, but because the truth had landed like a weight. I realized, watching her, that Mara had always been practicing for this moment, even when she didn't know it. The council delayed the vote, which was not victory, but it was time, and time is the currency movements live on. Lanterntide happened anyway, because Mara refused to let momentum rot. On the first Friday of June, the island lit itself from porch to pier. Children carried lanterns made from jars and paper, the flames replaced by safe little LEDs that Adrian had wired into reusable packs. Celeste organized a stage in the community hall and recruited local musicians to perform. Ewan and other fishermen grilled food by the harbor, smoky fish skewers, corn brushed with lime, and a sweet dough Marin fried in big batches. Mara and I ran between stations like exhausted producers, solving problems before they became disasters. A wind gust tried to topple a lantern arch. We tied it down with a knot Mara taught me. A generator sputtered. Adrian coaxed it back to life with gentle violence. A tourist tried to cross the turtle dune line. Marin guided them back with a smile that carried steel. The night's climax was the tide itself. When people stepped into the shallows, the water sparked blue around their ankles, and a hush fell over the crowd like prayer. In the middle of that glow, I saw Celeste and Marin standing side by side, watching the same light. For a moment, they looked like two versions of motherhood that had been forced into the same scene. One in city fabric, and one in salt-stained cotton, both trying not to show how much they wanted to protect someone. I walked toward them, and Mara walked toward them too from the other direction, and we met in a loose square of sand. We didn't hug in a dramatic pile. We simply stood close enough that warmth could pass between us. Celeste said, "You're both covered in paint." Marin said, "You're both hungry." Mara snorted in disbelief. "Obviously," she said. Then Celeste did something she rarely did without rehearsing. She reached out and smoothed a smudge of paint from Mara's cheek. Mara froze, then let it happen, eyes darting away as if affection might embarrass her more than anger ever could. Marin watched and swallowed hard. I realized then that love was not a limited resource, not if you stopped measuring it like money. It was a practice, like the festival, like the hatchery, like the work of keeping anything alive. 2 days after Lanterntide, the developer withdrew its offer, publicly citing community misalignment. Privately, we heard they didn't want the optics of suing an island full of turtle volunteers. The council announced a new committee to pursue protected status for the dunes, with oversight from hatchery representatives. It wasn't permanent safety, but it was a fence in the right direction. Back in Glassport, My theater teacher asked me to channel my recent experience into our spring performance. I told her I didn't want to turn my life into entertainment. She nodded, surprisingly respectful, and said, "Then channel it into craft. Make something true without exploiting yourself." That night, I started painting again. Not a backdrop, but a canvas for me. I painted Mara standing on the dock holding a lantern jar, the water glowing beneath her like spilled constellations. I painted her grin half hidden, defiant and bright. I painted the faint outline of turtle tracks leading toward the horizon. I titled it, "Not for Sale." The painting won a National Student Art Award, the kind that came with a small scholarship and a bigger invitation to show work abroad. People praised the authentic coastal mood and the political undertone. None of them understood that the most important part of the painting was the way Mara's hand gripped the jar, not possessive, but protective. When I told Mara the news, she pretended to be unimpressed. "Great," she texted. "Now you can afford better boots." Then she sent another message immediately after. "Proud of you. Don't get weird about it." I laughed and wiped my eyes. At home, Celeste pinned the award letter to the fridge like it was a playbill. Adrian measured the kitchen wall and said we should frame the painting properly. And then, because life cannot resist its own ironies, the Aurelia Playhouse received a final notice about structural repairs we couldn't afford. The theater that had raised me on borrowed light was going to close. I expected Celeste to collapse, but she didn't. She sat at the table with Marin on speakerphone and said, "Fine. We'll build something else." Adrian said. "I'm tired of patching a ship that keeps leaking," Mara suggested, with alarming cheer. "Why don't you move here and help us run the festival season?" Celeste laughed, then went quiet, considering. The idea sounded impossible, and yet the past year had trained me to distrust the word impossible. Kestrel Key needed people who could organize, advocate, and build. Glassport, frankly, had enough people doing those things for profit. A month later, Celeste and Adrian made the decision that would have shocked our former neighbors. They sold the theater's remaining equipment, paid off debts, and used the rest to buy a small storefront near the Glassport station. Not a theater, but a workshop and community classroom. They called it the Backstage Room, a place for free after-school tech and art classes. It was not glamorous. It was better, Celeste said. "If I can't keep one stage alive, I'll build many smaller ones inside kids who need them." The summer I turned 18, I split my time again, but differently. In Glassport, I taught younger kids how to paint sets and wire safe lights. In Kestrel Key, I taught volunteers how to design posters that didn't look like desperation. Mara and I grew into a rhythm that surprised us both. She teased me when I tried to apologize too much. I steadied her when her anger threatened to burn her out. Sometimes we fought, usually about small things: who forgot to buy batteries, who left paintbrushes in salt air. But underneath those fights was a foundation that felt real. We were choosing each other. One afternoon, after a long day at the hatchery, Mara sat on the porch steps and asked, quietly, "Do you ever wish it had been different?" I knew what she meant. I watched the yard where Marin hung laundry like flags, where Ewan repaired nets, where Celeste sat drinking tea with an island neighbor as if she belonged. I thought of Glassport's riverfront lights, the theater's dark aisles, the lab office's calm folders. Then I said, "Sometimes I wish nobody had been hurt by the storm. But I don't wish you out of my life." Mara nodded, jaw tight, as if she had been holding her breath. "Good," she said, "because I'm not leaving." On the first anniversary of the hearing, the protected status was approved, with restrictions that kept the dunes public and safeguarded nesting zones. The developer sued anyway, trying to grind us down with time. Celeste organized fundraising performances at the Backstage Room. Small staged readings, comedic monologues, kids' puppet shows. Adrian built a portable light rig that made the tiny space feel like magic. Marin sold Tide cakes and pickles, shipping boxes to donors who had never tasted the ocean. Ewan held boat tours that doubled as educational trips about dune ecology. Mara coordinated volunteer shifts with military precision, refusing to let exhaustion defeat us. I painted new posters every month, each one different, each one loud, because Mara was right. Island Hope had to be visible from far away. The lawsuit didn't vanish, but our community grew teeth. People who had never cared about Kestrel Key began to care because they had been invited into a story that wasn't sentimental, it was specific. Near the end of that year, I received an email from the hospital system that had begun the mess, offering a formal apology and a small settlement. It felt like being handed money for a scar. Celeste asked what I wanted to do with it. Mara suggested buying a bigger boat. Adrian suggested investing in hatchery infrastructure. Marin suggested paying for other families' DNA tests so nobody else would wait 17 years. I listened to them argue lovingly and realized that the best revenge on a chaotic past is organized generosity. So we used the settlement to create a fund, the Storm Ledger Fund, named not for drama but for accounting, because Adrian insisted. It paid for legal filing fees, beach cleaning gear, and transportation for students who wanted to volunteer but couldn't afford the ferry. On the first day we announced it, a kid from the mainland showed up to help track nests. He was nervous, clutching his backpack. Mara handed him a tin of roasted chickpeas and said, "Crunch these if you feel sick." The kid smiled, relief softening his face. I caught Mara's eye. She winked, as if our shared history had become a tool we could hand forward. In September, I left for college, an environmental design program that let me combine art and infrastructure. Glassport felt smaller when I packed my bags, like a set being struck after the final show. Before I left, Celeste and Adrian threw a farewell dinner that included island chowder, city pastries, and an embarrassing speech from my drama teacher. Marin and Ewan came too, traveling by ferry and train, looking slightly overwhelmed by the station crowds but refusing to show it. Mara arrived late, hair still damp from the tide, carrying a small jar. She placed it in my hands. Inside was sand from the dune line, sealed carefully. "Don't open it in your dorm," she warned. "Your roommate will hate you." I laughed. "Why give me sand?" Mara shrugged. "Because it's ours," she said. "And because you forget what you're fighting for when you get surrounded by shiny buildings." Celeste pressed her lips together, eyes wet. Adrian cleared his throat and said, "Use a sturdy shelf. Sand is heavy." The room laughed, and the laughter made the leaving bearable. College was a new storm, one made of deadlines and unfamiliar faces. Professors spoke in acronyms. Students bragged about internships like they were Bloodlines. On nights when I felt like an imposter again, I held the sand jar and remembered that belonging was not inherited. I visited Kestrel Key during breaks, and each time the island welcomed me back without ceremony, the way tides return. Mara grew taller somehow. Or maybe she simply grew more certain. Celeste's workshop thrived, packed with kids learning how to solder and paint. Adrian began teaching basic electrical safety to dock workers, translating city codes into island practice. Marin started a community cookbook fundraiser that became unexpectedly famous, because people love recipes that come with a cause. Ewan learned to enjoy telling stories to tourists, though he pretended he hated it. Life didn't become simple. It became shared. One winter, a severe storm threatened the island again, the kind that made the ocean sound like a warning. The dunes held, because we had protected them. The hatchery building took damage, but the new reinforcement Adrian designed kept the worst of the surge out. Volunteers moved supplies into safe storage, following the checklists Mara had drafted. On the mainland, Celeste opened the backstage room as a temporary warming center for people whose power went out. She turned stage lights into practical light. Watching all of it, I felt a strange gratitude for the original storm. Not because it was good, but because it had introduced me to the truth that preparation is love in physical form. When the storm passed, Mara and I stood on the repaired pier, hair whipped by cold wind, and watched the sea settle back into its ordinary deception. She said, "You know what I hate?